Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed listeners, we're super excited to bring you this interview with Bernie Gurr. Bernie served as the Sydney Roosters CEO from 1994 to 2003 and the Parramatta Eels CEO from 2016 until 2019. In this in-depth interview, we tackle some of the hard-hitting, game-related issues, including, do NRL clubs have too much power? Is the season too long? Where does rugby league sit in the Australian sporting landscape? Why he stood down from the USARL, and many more. We hope you enjoy this interview. Follow us for weekly episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, Stuart and I are super excited to have Bernie Gurr on the show today. Bernie is the former Roosters and Parramatta CEO amongst many other roles and has been involved with rugby league from an administrative point of view for many decades now. Bernie, welcome to the show.
Hello guys, very, very happy to be with you.
Good to hear. And as always, Stuart's with me. Stuart, you keeping well, mate?
I'm keeping very well. I'm fresh from a wedding in Dubbo over the weekend, so and I'm back in Canberra, raring to go. Thanks again for coming on the show, Bernie. Can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah, look, I was born in Newcastle in 1957, which seems an enormous amount of time ago. My family moved to Sydney in the early 60s, and then we settled in the eastern suburbs of Sydney in Randwick. And then my first recollection of rugby league actually was in 1965. My grandfather, who was a great rugby league fan, him and his wife, actually, they both love rugby league, my mother's parents. My first vivid memory of rugby league was him taking me to the 1965 grand final at the cricket ground between St George and Souths. And there was a crowd of 78,056 that was reported. I think the reality was there was probably over 90,000 there, because at the end of it was the last of the non-ticketed grand finals. So it was a free for all to get in. And in the end, they ended up opening the gates, and there were people, sitting on the terraces of the showground grandstands overlooking the cricket ground. But my one vivid memory is I was one of the kids they let over the fence to sit on the grass. Because the ground, and particularly the hill area where we were, was so packed. So that was my introduction to rugby league. And since then, I've just had a lifelong love of rugby league. I grew up in the eastern suburbs. I went to Marcellin College at Randwick, which has a great rugby league tradition. And I have two brothers, an elder brother, Patrick, and a younger brother, Marty. We went there and we all played rugby league there. Then I went on to play Eastern Suburbs Catholic Club Juniors in the Roosters district. Then got to grade in 1978, and then that sort of started my journey in senior rugby league. But I've always loved the game. I grew up, devouring everything I could from back in the 60s when I was a kid, in the late 60s. There were two morning newspapers, the Herald and the Telegraph, and there were also two afternoon newspapers, the Sun and the Daily Mirror. So we were, getting to read 4 newspapers a day and look at all the sporting happenings, including and particularly rugby league, it was heaven for a young kid that loved his sport.
Actually, talking about newspapers, Bernie, I can remember going to the sports ground. We're probably around the same vintage, and being a kid, and you'd go to the game, and then you'd come out of the game at the end, and people would be selling newspapers with reports on the game in those newspapers. And I always wondered how it'd often be up to halftime score or something like that. But I thought, how the hell did they get those newspapers to the ground so quickly with a report in them?
Yeah, well, no, it was amazing. To be able to read, like, we get social media now in addition to the old traditional media, but back in the day, they really made a big effort to make sure the traditional media got the news and the scores and the details to the fans.
Exactly.
Wow, I absolutely love that. That's a pure education lesson for me.
You're too young for it, Keith.
Entertain you. The only one I remember was MX, which used to come out when you catch a train in the afternoon around.
You should be happy. You should be happy, Keith. You're too young to remember that.
All right. Well, next question. You've got fairly extensive administrative experience in the rugby league world. Can you tell our listeners about some of the clubs that you've worked with or worked for?
Yeah, sure. It was I played at East just prior to all that. I played at East between about 78 and 83. So I had 5 seasons in grade at the Roosters. Played over 100 grade games at only about 4 or 5 first grade games. So believe me, I was not a very good player. Good enough to play grade and a few first grade games. And, I was very happy with that, given my limited abilities. My brother Marty went on to play a lot of first grade games, played State of Origin, and he was a terrific player. But, I just still love the game. And when I went to grade in 1978 at the Roosters, Arthur Beetson was the captain coach of the club. Ron Coote was having his last year in rugby league, and Bob Fulton had come over from Manly in 1977. So he was there in 78 as well. So it was, looking back on it, and we're, all three grades used to train together then. So all us young blokes were out on the training track on a Tuesday and Wednesday night with these great players. And of course, those three players, Beetson, Coote and Fulton, are now immortals. So when you look back on it, John Quayle was my first coach. He was my under-23s coach at the Roosters. And of course, John went on to be the CEO of the New South Wales Rugby League and then the Australian Rugby League. Paul Cross, well-known rugby league player, was a coach there as well. So, look, it was just an amazing time to be a young player. So I had obviously a love of the Roosters. I ended up marrying an American girl, Peggy, and moving to the United States in 1987. And I was very fortunate over there. I worked for Ernst & Young. And then around 1993, I wanted to get into, for a while I'd wanted to get into sports administration and management. And some of the people at Ernst & Young in Los Angeles knew that. And a job became available for Director of Finance for the World Cup Soccer Organisation, which was running the 1994 Soccer World Cup. So I was very fortunate. I got that job as Director of Finance. And that was an amazing experience to be the Director of Finance. I also I became effectively the General Manager of ticketing as well. So we had over street value over $120 million worth of tickets that we needed to distribute and organise, which, again, a phenomenal experience for a young guy like me who wanted to get involved in sports administration, because I was a trained chartered accountant, but with my sports background, I wanted to get into sports administration. And luckily I got that role. From, the World Cups have a finite existence. They end. And at the end of 94, I was looking around and thinking, well, I want another sports experience. And I put in a call to John Quayle, who was by then the head of the Australian Rugby League, and said, look, John, I've been working over here for a few years in sports and love to come back if there was an opportunity. And he happened to say, well, look, I know the Roosters are looking for a CEO. So he let Nick Politis, who'd only recently become the chairman of the Roosters. Nick had only been in for about 6 months, and he was looking for a CEO. So Nick had business interests in the US. He happened to be in the US pretty soon after that. He interviewed me, and then I came back to be the CEO of the Roosters starting in October of 1994. And then I think 1 or 2 months earlier, Phil Gould had joined Gus. So Nick had brought in Phil Gould as coach, myself as CEO, and then that basically commenced the journey of trying to rebuild the Roosters, who'd had a pretty lean trot prior to that. So then I was 9 years at the Roosters. We had a great time there. Nick was, clearly the leader of the club. I was CEO, helping the club advance. Gus had 5 great years as coach. We had Graham Murray for 2 years, Ricky Stewart for 2 years. We made the finals 8 years in a row, Final Four 5 times, 3 times grand finalists when we won the premiership in 2002. That's a bit of a snapshot of my time at the Roosters, which was a brilliant time because it was my childhood club. I loved the club, and to be able to go back there as CEO and combine my profession with my passion for rugby league, and particularly the Roosters, I just felt very fortunate and privileged to be able to do that. Then by 2003, my oldest son was ready to go into high school in the US, and we were thinking about a move back to the US, and we did that. So I finished at the Roosters. Then I'd had 13 years in the US at that time, and my main job there was for about 10 years was as Director of Finance for the Crown Worldwide Group, which is a worldwide logistics and moving relocation company. And then in 2016, the people were looking for a new CEO at Parramatta, and they reached out and said, would you be interested? And I said, look, I'm happy to talk to you. I wasn't looking to come back at that time. I have a good job there. But of course, rugby league can be very tempting to be involved in. And after a number of discussions, I took the job at Parramatta, and I had 3 years there, and I finished up there at the end of 2019. So that was a very, very demanding job at Parramatta because, as you're probably well aware, they had some major governance issues. They had some substantial reputational damage, salary cap issues, other issues within the club where the governance was very, very poor. The football program was at a pretty static level. It needed improvement. So yeah, I did that for 3 years, and then at the end of 2019, I left, and then COVID hit, and I've been spending time back and forth ever since then. But that's a bit of a snapshot. So all in all, with 9 years at the Roosters and 3 years at Parramatta, I've had 12 years as a club CEO.
Bernie, we talked about your administrative career then, but I just want to take us back a little bit, back to your playing career. Just about your junior days where you played and coming to grade, and then, as you said, you ticked up around 5 first grade matches. Was there any regrets that you didn't play more first grade matches?
Look, there probably is a regret that I didn't play more first grade matches, but I had a business career. I was attending university. I was doing I was studying for a finance degree at the University of New South Wales, which I eventually got. And then when I got that, I was still playing lower grades, and I went on to work at Arthur Young, which is now Ernst and Young, in the city. So I was balancing I was juggling a lot of balls in the air. So, and look, at that time, East, under Beats and first, and then Bob Fulton as coach, they were a very, very strong club. So there were plenty of very good players, better players than me in front of me, and I sort of understood that at the time. But yeah, I would have loved to have played more first grade games. But look, in the end, I was happy to play, four or five, and one of them was the major semi in 1980 against the Bulldogs, who ended up winning the competition that year. So that was a big game at the cricket ground. So look, it would have been nice to play more, but just to get on a first grade football field, I was very happy with. And of course, I'd played in the Eastern Suburbs juniors, and I played with the Eastern Suburbs Catholic Club, and we were a pretty strong club. We had a bit of success there. And then in 1978, Paul Cross, the ex-Balmain and Roosters winger, was the coach of the East President's Cup side, the under-21 side. And we actually won that competition, when we beat, so that you had the smallest junior league, East, we beat Penrith, the largest junior league, in the final of the President's Cup. So that's something very unique. It'll never happen again. And, we just happened to have a great crew of young players, and Paul Cross was our coach. But look, I really enjoyed that. And then being able then to go from there on to grade was terrific.
Was there much sibling rivalry growing up with your brother Marty?
No, not really. No, we only played in the same team a couple of times. 1 year in the junior league, and then I played 1 year with my older brother in the B grade competition. So I'd actually had a year with each of them. So no, there was never any sibling rivalry. And once we got to grade, Marty progressed. He was a full. He came in as more of a 5'8", quite frankly. Played 5'8" in our President's Cup side that won it, and you could tell he was going to be a very good player. And then Bozo Fulton moved him to fullback, and then he went on to have a really great career with the Roosters, and then he had a stint 1 year at South, 3 or 4 years at Manly, and then he ended up playing, I think, one season over there with Leeds in the English league. So no, there was never any rivalry. He was, I was very happy when he was successful, and there was never any sibling rivalry there at all. I was just very happy that he went and had a great career.
As international rugby league fans and fans both here in Australia and of the overseas game, a lot of us get frustrated with the squabbling that goes on, and it's not, excuse me, it's not really fulfilling the sport's potential. Do you think this is still the case, or are things improved?
I think that they're gradually improving. I think there's been a bit of a commitment over the last, say, 5 years or so, of my understanding, that to make the IRL, the International Rugby League, a more important group. Now, the only way that's going to be more important is if the NRL supports it, because the NRL they drive the bus in rugby league, because basically, whether you're in Australia, New Zealand, England, France, or the Pacific Islands, or the USA, the NRL, they're the biggest, they have the most money, they're the most influential. So you need the support of the NRL. I think they've started to commence that journey to making the IRL more important. But of course, it absolutely needs the imprimatur of the NRL. I think they need to get, and look, they've tried the last couple of years, but I think they need to increase their focus on international play. I know they're trying to develop a 5-year international calendar. I spent a bit of time on the US Rugby League board for a little while there, not too long, but there were some other issues around that. They're trying to make it a more important thing. I'd like to see a schedule where every 4 years you have a kangaroo tour, wouldn't be a kangaroo tour like we used to do in the 60s, 70s, and 80s because that just doesn't allow that anymore. But I would like that every 4 years, and then every second year, and then on a 4-year basis, have a Rugby League World Cup. I would like to see that happen. I think that would be a very good thing for the game and would more or less formalise those two important things in our international calendar.
I tend to agree. And I think obviously the more nations we have that are competitive, the better. So it can obviously include everyone wherever possible. That would be the best case scenario. But speaking not just from an international rugby league point of view, but just in general, do you think that NRL clubs have too much power?
Look, the NRL clubs drive, their ability to generate. Their bottom line is there's no money in rugby league unless, in this case, 17 clubs sit around a table and say we'll play some games. Once they agree to sit around that table, they agree to play some games. That starts the business mechanism ticking. That's suddenly you have TV revenue, suddenly you have merchandise revenue, suddenly you have broadcast revenue, suddenly you have gate revenue. All the revenues that come into the game, they germinate from the very simple position that 17 clubs sit around the table and say, we're going to play games against each other. Now, of course, the ARLC and through them the NRL, they are the governing body. Once those 17 clubs agree to play games, they're the governing body that ensures that the game is run with good governance and there's some potential sustainability for the game. But I don't think the clubs have too much power. I think if you put a common sense program before the clubs, I think most of the NRL clubs understand the need for an international element to our game. It sets us apart from the AFL. Of course, you're always going to get it's always going to be a balance between. We can't have our game is too difficult. It's too physical. It's too brutal. You can't have players playing 11, 12 months a year. It just doesn't work. So they need to get a valid break. So that's why I think if every 2 years you had a World Cup, then another 2 years you had a kangaroo tour, and then maybe in those off years you maybe played a game in some international against New Zealand or some Pacific Nations games. That would probably be a good balance, but you still need to allow the players some rest and some time off in between the seasons.
Do you think this is a question not on the run sheet, Stu? Do you think the season is too long? Would you shorten it? And do you think it's commercially viable to do so?
Absolutely, the season needs to be shortened. I've put a proposal up. I wrote a proposal probably 10, 15 years ago now that the season should be no longer than 22 games. They're currently playing 26 games over 27 weeks. I think it should be 22 games, 11 home, 11 away. Now, how you work that with 17 teams, 18 teams, and eventually 20 teams, when you get to 20 teams, you'd actually play everybody once. And then you could probably handpick 2 rounds of what you could call rivalry games. You'd have Brisbane playing the Dolphins, you'd have Roosters playing Rabbitohs, and you'd have Manly playing the new Bears that are coming back in it, apparently. And then you'd have 22 games. I think I'm a big fan of standalone state of origin. Rugby league's the only sport in the world where 6 rounds of the year, the rounds before 3 origins and the rounds after origin, are impacted where your very best players, the players that bring the fans into the game, the players that draw eyeballs to TV, they're not in the game. Like, it would be unheard of in American football if you said, well, for 25% of the games, we're going to have this other thing, an all-star game, and all our best players are either going to be injured, not allowed to play, or they can't back up. It's absurd. And I think what it does also, if you have that mid-season period and you where you had standalone origin games, what it does is when the club games do resume, it's not only the origin players that can play. So you got your very best players playing all the games, but your other players get healthier. The standard of health of every team would improve. Now, what's all that mean? If you shorten the season from 27 weeks to 22 weeks plus 3 origin weekends, you're not providing the product that you have now to the TV station. So there would be a little bit of revenue, but again, it's a balance. You want the season to be a balance of what's fair to the players, what's good for the fans. And let's face it, during the origin every year, club football tends to wane a bit because inherently the fans understand the very best players we have, our most attractive players to the fans, are not playing. I find it, having observed a lot of the US sports over the years, because I've lived over there so long, it would be absolutely untenable, isn't it? It would not be accepted. They would not allow it to happen. So I think you could combine the fact of reducing the season. I know Phil Gould's a proponent of it. I've been a long time proponent. Too many games. And in the NFL, they play 16 games. That's it. Our players play 24. That's 50% more games. I think sometimes less is more.
I
And
reckon you could cap out almost all games if we only had 22 rounds. If we somehow got rid of very unattractive, even Thursday 8 p.m. There's a school night that affects the crowds, and if we made ticket prices affordable for families and just your average Joes that wanted $20 tickets like the Warriors do, you could sell out almost every game in the NRL, maybe with the exception of a core stadium. I really believe that.
yeah, that's a potential. The reality is this year, and I've been astounded and been watching it very closely from a commercial perspective, the crowds this year are unbelievable. Brookvale's been selling out nearly every game. The Warriors have been selling out nearly every game. Nearly every club has increased crowds. Like if you go back and historically look at the average crowds in the NRL all the way back to the New South Wales Rugby League, people tend to look at it through rose-coloured glasses. Some of the average crowds were diabolically bad. The crowds this year have been sensational. The interest in the game, and I'm observing it from afar. I watch a number of games in the US every weekend. Um, it's amazing. I think the standard of play, the athleticism, the skill level, the interest in the game now, the saturation media coverage, all that is driving, I think, very much a renewed interest in people attending games. And I was out at the Allianz Stadium yesterday for the Roosters Raiders game, and I was very heartened by the number of young kids that were there, families that were there. And I'm thinking, this is a very good thing. It wasn't just old people out there, it was a lot of young people. I think from that perspective, rugby league's they're on a bit of a high at the moment. The interest probably in the game has never been greater, which is a great thing. And I think it can be even further popularised if we have a reduced season and standalone origin games. And it would be even more of an attractive proposition, because I don't think you'd lose much revenue, because the years like we're having now, they demonstrate to the media companies, Fox and Nine, just how valuable rugby league is.
I'm pretty sure on the weekend, actually, Bernie, the round we've just had was a record round as far as crowds. Something like 267,000 or something over the weekend. I mean, you got 50,000 over 50,000 up at Brisbane, 35,000, I think, to the Bulldogs Manly game. The game you attended, I think, was around 25 or something like that. So yeah,
20, almost
28
28.
was it? Yeah,
Yeah. Well, that game at Acor Stadium between Manly and the Bulldogs, the 6 p.m. game, which usually is a graveyard shift. Clubs hate that game. They hate it to death. That's the highest drawing ground attendance at a Friday 6 p.m. game in history. So that just shows you, when you have these big Sydney clubs that are like Canterbury and Manly, the Eels, Souths, Roosters, when they're doing well, they can draw good crowds, particularly in the current environment where the game is enjoying, a resurgence in popularity.
exactly. And talking about big Sydney clubs, obviously, yes, you were previously the CEO of the Roosters, which is a considered by universally as a well run club. Do you have any insights in how the Roosters can attract such good players?
Well, there is a salary cap, and the Roosters are subject to the audit by the NRL salary cap auditors. Look, the reality is the Roosters have a lot of good things going for them. They've always got a good coach. They always have very strong administration led by Nick Politis, and now Joe Kelly as the CEO. It's a very attractive part of Sydney to live in. They're always going to be competing for semi-finals, and if you're in that quality of a team, you're exponentially increasing your chances of playing representative football. And the other thing to remember when you look at the Roosters, and because, we got some of these accusations when I was there, you're full of star players. I said, yeah, but I did an analysis then. And if you do an analysis now, if you look at the number of players that have played the predominant number of their first grade games, they've been at the Roosters. Like Jared Warrior-Hargraves, he played 6 games at Manly. He's played like 300 for the Roosters. You look at the Butcher brothers. You look at Jake Friend. You look at Boyd Cordner. They've come through the Roosters development system. And suddenly when they become star players, the Roosters wonder how they have so many star players. Well, when you develop players the way the Roosters have, and they're different. A lot of the Penrith players come from the Penrith Junior League, or they come from out west, Dubbo, like Isaiah Yeo comes from. The Roosters don't have so Penrith have a two-pronged development approach. One's their junior league, and then they offset that with going and scouting players outside their junior league. The Roosters, by definition, don't have a big junior league. They have to scout externally. They've got to go to Queensland and identify Sam Walker, for example. And that was an unfortunate injury Sam got yesterday. They have to identify a Joseph Suaalii from the GPS competition. And if you go back and look at the number of Roosters that debuted in first grade, they've come through the Roosters development system, and then suddenly people get upset. And every now and again they go and cherry pick a good player, but a lot of clubs do that. So I think it's and then what you do when you bring them through your development system, you end up getting them a little cheaper at the start of their career. And when they're part of your club and you treat them like family, and their families feel like you treat those young players like family, and the Roosters do, they want to stay. So if another club offers them 500,000, they're good clubs, the Melbournes, the Roosters, the Penriths, these sort of clubs. The player that gets 500 offer from a club that's running down the bottom of the table, they'll stay at a Penrith or a Melbourne or a Roosters for 380, 400. Because after tax, it might be another 50 or 60 grand. They're not winning games every week. They're not part of a club they love. So, when you build that type of club, you get those intangible benefits. And if you look after your players, and also if people just did a bit of analysis around where did these players debut? Who developed these players? Like even back in the day I was there, we had Brian Fletcher, Luke Ricketson, Shannon Haggerty, Ryan Cross, Peter Cusack, Oscar Simon Bernetti. All those players, they debuted in first grade at the Roosters. They became stars, but they came through the Roosters development system, no different than the Penrith players are coming through their development system now.
Yeah, shout out to Chris Flannery. Were there any...
One of my favourites.
Were there any particular areas that you focus on? Acknowledging what is indisputable is the Bondi catchment area, etc. Coogee is a very, very small catchment area in terms of rugby league. So you answered in the previous question that you looked to Queensland, you looked far and wide, etc. But were there any formalised junior areas that weren't in the eastern suburbs that belonged to the Roosters?
No. See, what's happened is over the years, when the New South Wales Rugby League started in 1908, they defined certain geographic areas to the 10 clubs or eight or 10 clubs that existed then. Over time, and particularly when you got into the 60s, in 1966 we had 10 clubs. In 1967, we had the commencement of limited tackle football, 4 tackle football, because previous to that it was unlimited. But coinciding with the introduction of limited tackle football in 1967, which a lot of St George fans say was introduced to stop their domination, but it wasn't. But basically the game was becoming boring. In the same year of 67, the 10 existing clubs, including the Roosters, the Rabbitohs, the Bulldogs, everybody at that time, even though they weren't the Bulldogs then, they were the Berries, they voted to expand the game and bring in Penrith and Cronulla because Sydney was expanding. Now, so that was a decision that those 10 clubs had dug the well, but they wanted to expand the game and allow those expanding clubs in. Ironically, one of those clubs they let in, Penrith, was given this huge catchment area of Western Sydney, which over time proved to be a tremendous breeding ground. And I'm not knocking that. I love what Penrith are doing. I think it's fantastic. They're developing the game. They're bringing a lot of players through. They're not just developing players, they're developing fans for the game as well. But anyway, take that to the next level. In 1988, those Sydney clubs then elected to say, we're going to vote to expand the game again. We're going to bring in Brisbane and the Gold Coast. And have I forgotten one there? I may have forgotten one. And then in 1995, of course, we had Auckland Warriors come in at that time. We had the North Queensland.
Newcastle.
Newcastle came in 88, correct. So what's my point here? The macro point here is that these clubs that had dug the well for years had never been allocated a new junior area. Like no one said to the Roosters or the Rabbitohs when they agreed to expansion, we're going to expand your area. No one ever said that. They dug the well for the game. These other clubs came in and it's the right decision. No one's knocking that. What I'm trying to do is put a bit of balance into the issue around this. Why didn't those clubs get more geographic area dedicated to them? They probably should have. Anyway, the expansion of the game has been brilliant. I think it's the clubs that have been brought into the game over the last, quite frankly, 50, 60 years, every one of them has added something to our game. But yeah, it's an interesting now, even the big clubs, even like the Broncos, the Cowboys, the Warriors, whilst they have huge catchment areas, every club is a recruitment club. They all go outside their area to find a good player. The Warriors come to Australia to find good players, like, Kevin Campion and Ivan Cleary went over there back in the early 2000s. North Queensland has pegged a number of very good. They got Thurston out of the Bulldogs. Brisbane over the years have cherry picked some good players from Sydney to come up and play in the Broncos, even though they've got probably the best catchment area in the league. So don't be confused. Every club is a recruitment club, not only for their own geographic area, but looking outside. They've got people, Broncos and all these big clubs with big catchment areas, they're looking outside as well. And that's not a bad thing, but it's just a reality.
We've talked about the Roosters quite a bit, Bernie, but the other club that you were CEO was Parramatta, which I can imagine had some very different issues than the Roosters. Can you talk about your time there as Eels CEO?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when I went to, just backtracking one, so when I went to the Roosters, Nick Politis was the chairman. Even though the club needed rebuilding on the football side, there was a Nick had brought in. He made the club very stable. There were no governance issues. The club was, you could tell with his leadership, it was going to be a very well managed club. So we just had to get in there, all get on the same page. And then Phil Good was our head coach. Brian Canavan was our football manager. And then we just commenced the journey of improving the footy club, which we did. And they all made great contributions, Nick and obviously, and Phil and Brian. Parramatta was a different kettle of fish. Parramatta had major governance issues. They'd had major salary cap scandals. They'd had officials disqualified. So we had a lot of reputational damage there. So when we identified the issues that needed to be fixed at Parramatta, we had to go through that process. Max Donnelly was from Ferrier Hodgson. He was put in as the interim chairman by the Liquor and Gaming Board because not only the football club, but the leagues club had problems and they'd been connected to the wrongdoings of the football club. So it was a monumental job for Max. He put me in to say, well, look, we need to work together to fix this. So it was a very big and time-consuming job. There were constitutional reforms led by Max. We brought in a brand new board of directors in 2017 in the start around February 2017. So we had a new chairman, new board, new CEO. We then started making sure we got our management team correct. All the while, we're trying to keep our eye on football because at the end of the day, we're a football club. You've got to win games. So, I was also working very closely with Brad Arthur and Peter Sharp was our recruitment manager at that time. So there were a lot of balls being juggled in the air at Parramatta. But look, we took about a year to get a new major sponsor because of the reputational damage around the club. But gradually we rebuilt the trust with the NRL, number one, because we had to show them that we were abiding to the letter of the law with the salary cap. So we had a very close relationship with the NRL salary cap auditors, which exists to this day to make sure we're doing everything properly. We had to rebuild our relationship with our sponsors and commercial partners. Probably most importantly, we had to rebuild our relation with our fans. We had to give our fans an understanding that the Parramatta Club was going to act professionally and ethically at all times. The one thing I sent a number of, memos and communications, and we had, get-togethers of fans at the Eels. And the one thing I said to them was, we can't guarantee success, but we'll guarantee this club will be professionally run. It'll be ethically run. And we'll tick every governance box that we need to tick to make sure we have a club that's stable. And then we can start the journey on getting financially sustainable, which they are now. Parramatta's now, from a financial point of view, albeit they're not doing very well on the football field at the moment, they're a very stable club behind the scenes, and they're financially very strong. Like the year before I joined, the club lost $12 million.
Wow.
12. Then we got that down to about 4, then eventually down to about 3. And all that's all got to be funded by your leagues club at the time. Now, the economics of football clubs have changed over the last 5 years. They've got increased broadcasting revenue. They got some relief through COVID for the employment part of it. So now most rugby league clubs now are cash flow positive and profitable, which is outstanding because for years, all rugby league clubs, even back in the so-called heyday of the game, most of the Sydney clubs are supported by leagues clubs. So specifically back to Parramatta, after 3 years, I think we put Parramatta back on a course where it was a strong, financially sustainable and respected club again. And I felt that. And Parramatta has such a support base. It has, and with that geographical location at Parramatta, which is effectively the middle of Sydney these days, Parramatta is a powerhouse. And now I know it doesn't necessarily reflect in the results at the moment, but Parramatta will be strong again on the field. But the first thing you've got to do is make sure they're well governed off the field and financially strong, which they are now. They are that. They're just obviously now they're going to focus on their football program. But yeah, it was a great challenge at Parramatta, but I really enjoyed the club. There's a lot of great people in Parramatta. Their fans are they are real fans. They're fanatics. And they're a great asset to the game of rugby league. And quite frankly, when you have clubs like the Bulldogs, the Tigers, the Panthers, the Eels in Western Sydney, which is a heartland of our game, you have them going well. Like I promise you, if they're playing for the wooden spoon this Friday at Campbelltown, it'll be a sellout because the Tigers and the Eels have strong support base. And then you marry that with other traditional clubs like the Roosters and Manly and Rabbitohs. If you can get those clubs doing well, then Sydney crowds are usually very good. But just back to the Parramatta point, Stuart, it was really enjoyable time. It was a lot of hard work, but there was a lot of good people at Parramatta that contributed to getting Parramatta back on track off the field. Yeah.
Yeah, great answer. Fascinating answer as well. So thanks for that insight. Changing tact slightly here, Brad Bolters from NRL.com recently wrote an article that you were the accountant for a Duran Duran tour. Did you meet the band and we're a big fan?
Well, I was working for Arthur Young in 1983 in Sydney, and Arthur Young in London had done their tax and financial consulting work for the Duran Duran band, and then they contacted our office in Sydney and said, look, they're coming out to do a tour of Australia, and we need someone to be the finance manager for the tour in Australia. And for some reason, the couple of partners at Ernst & Young or Arthur Young in Sydney, they tapped me on the shoulder and said, look, we need someone to travel around and run the finances and, control all the cash distributions to the roadies and just run it from a financial point of view. It was a six city trip around Australia. So, yeah, I did get to meet the band, and that was a eye-opening experience.
Fantastic.
Bernie, it's no secret the USARL has had their problems, and you were brought onto the board, fairly recently in July, but stepped down shortly after. What was the reason for that, and what are the challenges for USA Rugby League domestically?
Yeah, first of all, I went on in good faith and wanted to help the organisation, but I had some issues going on personally with my family, and then I had to come back to Australia for 2 weeks. And the board members that are working on the USARL are terrific people. They have the good intent of the game at their heart, but there's no executive office with the USARL. There's no full-time staff at the USARL. So basically, the 9 directors have to do all the traditional administrative work and management work around the USARL and their operations. So for family and personal reasons, I was on there for about 2 months, and the hours were quite demanding, and I just couldn't. And then I was traveling to Australia, and I just didn't feel I could be, in all fairness, give them what they needed from a time point of view. But I support them totally, and I've told them if I can help them in any consulting way in the future, I would love to do it. I have. The people I met on that board were terrific people. I hope they're successful. So that was my side of it. So I am happy to help them where I can help them in the future. Just their challenges. Look, the challenges are immense in the United States. And whilst the NRL are dipping their toe in the water over there with the 5-year commitment to play the opening games in Vegas, as per the NRL and Peter V'landys, the main objective of their move into the United States was to get gambling revenue. They figured, and the NRL stated this, it's not my statement, it's the NRL statement, that they want to get gambling revenue out of the United States, because in 2018 in the United States, they opened up all the states to legalize sports betting. Prior to that, you had basically 2 states. You had Nevada with Las Vegas, and you had New Jersey with Atlantic City. As of today, 38 of the 50 states, you have legalized sports gambling, and that will increase. It'll go to 50. So with knowing that, and with Peter Volandi's history in Racing New South Wales and gambling, that's where I think the driver is. He thinks if we could get rugby league over there, it'd become the gambling revenue of Americans gambling, and rugby league would be another revenue stream. And that's what's been publicly stated. They had an additional, I guess, sub-objective, which came up just before the first NRL fixtures over there this year, whereby they ran a combine hoping to get some players to come back to the NRL. And they did. They got a few players out of it. I actually was in Vegas for the games, and I went to the combine, and they picked a couple of men and a couple of young ladies to come and play over here and at least try out for the NRL team. So I think that's a secondary objective. But the main objective was to get the gambling revenue. And look, the event, they put on a wonderful event. It was like an NRL party in Las Vegas. And, me and my family and friends, we really enjoyed it. And when you're living in the US, to get some real rugby league's a real treat. Otherwise, you're just watching it on TV. So that was great. But the challenges for the NRL in the United States and the challenges for the USARL in the United States is to get awareness and to get traction. And it's easy to say, well, they got 330 million people. We just need to get a piece of that. But that's a very simplistic and, quite frankly, not a valid argument. America is the most sophisticated sports market in the world. I've worked in it. I've observed it. I've lived over there on and off probably 25 years over the last 40 years. I've lived in the United States. And they, with legalized sports gambling being opened up in America, the best and brightest sports executives in the world are sitting over there with the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, National League Hockey, and college sports, because college football is the second biggest sport in America. All those executives are sitting back thinking, well, how do we get our cut of that? So that's the competition for the gambling revenue. Now, and when you have that and you're marketing that for your sport, most people are going to gravitate towards the sports that are inherent to that country. They don't, and the reality is the games in Las Vegas at the start of this year, it really, from a point of view of building awareness in America, it basically did not get any traction in the United States. Now, it doesn't make me happy to say that, because if there's one person that would love rugby league to get real traction in the US, it's me. I love the game. I want to contribute to the game, and I would love to see it get a foothold because it's such a great game. But America is a very crowded, sophisticated marketplace in professional sports. Trying to penetrate that market and bring a new sport in is extremely difficult. Look at soccer. When we finished the World Cup in '94, we left a legacy of $70 million, a lot of money at the time, to grow the game of soccer in the United States. And part of that was setting up Major League Soccer in 1996. Only in the last, literally, probably 8 to 10 years, and really only the last 5 years, is the MLS getting any traction as a second-tier sport, not a top-tier sport. And, they've had to bring in people like Beckham and Messi, and it's the global game, and they're now starting to get a bit of traction for their sport. In addition, Major League Rugby, which has a bit of a history in the colleges as a bit of a cult sport, it had a bit of a base there to work off. Major League Rugby is going broke as we speak. Clubs are failing. The LA clubs failed. It's gone broke. So I'm not saying that in taking any delight in it, because we'd like all sports to be successful. It just shows, no matter the basis you have in the sport, no matter the ethnicity you have around a sport such as soccer, trying to penetrate the big sports in America and get any substantial traction is extremely difficult. Now, it doesn't mean rugby league can't do it, but the size of the challenge is absolutely immense. I'll guarantee you, the games at the start of the year, the rugby league games, they got no traction through mainstream sports media in America. And I'm looking for it because I want to see it. So I don't take any delight in saying that, but it was basically an NRL party, an NRL event. And quite frankly, I think from a marketing point of view, with all the great reporting from that event coming back to Australia, I think that kick-started this renewed interest in attendances of games. I think it was probably the greatest pre-season marketing tool they ever could have had, because the marketing was coming back to, they're having this bigger party and big event in the United States. And I think that really kick-started the promotion of the game back in Australia for the 2024 season. Unfortunately, and again, I'm not happy to say it, there was no real cut through to the American sports marketplace. And like I said, I try to promote it to as many people as I
Sure.
could over there. I would love it to be successful. Now, back to the USARL itself, the challenge is growing the game. Basically, there's no professional sports league, no professional rugby league competition in America. The players are amateur, and that's the challenge. The challenge is to try and take that amateur sport and even initially gravitate it to even a semi-professional level. Major League Rugby went broke trying to make their game a professional sport in America. No cut through whatsoever, and it's very expensive. So it's going to be quite the challenge, and it's going to have to be an incremental stair step approach to try and over time build that. But I think it's a very slow burn. But of course, I'll do whatever I can to support it because I love the game.
Yeah, fascinating answer as well. And I think from memory, 55,000 was the TV ratings in America or something like that. But I don't think anyone, you're right, I don't think anyone actually anticipated the knock on effects to the ratings here in Australia and just putting rugby league, making a huge statement that we're more than a suburban sport now. You know, we're an event. We're first class of world event at that in terms of we're taking the game to Las Vegas. The footage beaming back from America was phenomenal, and that really excited every Australian fan, and even the fans that just sort of casually only watch Origin, etc. They looked on like, wow, that's impressive. Maybe I should watch this sport. So it was a real statement game for the NRL. So I agree with everything you just said.
Unfortunately, 90% of those people you were preaching to the converted. There was the additional 10% and that add-on effect that I think really did help to promote the game in Australia. But there was, as I said, there was no real, but the NRL never really stated an objective that they wanted to help to grow the game in America. What they wanted to do was get American people to gamble on the game. Now, number one, you can't gamble unless people are aware. So you need an awareness program to let them know the games are on, to even try to entice them to gamble on the game. Number two, most NRL games are in the middle of the night in America. And one thing hardcore gamblers usually like to do is watch their bets live. If there's a horse race, people watch it. If there's a game, they watch it. Well, American gamblers are not going to get up at 3 a.m. to watch Brisbane play the Roosters. They're just not going to do it. So it's very difficult to get people to gamble on things that they can't watch live. And that's another complication they have there. Not to mention, my understanding is in Australia, the NRL does, they do deals with betting companies where they get a piece of the action. I don't know the specifics of it, but I know it's different in the United States. They don't just get a commission of gambling turnover. There's another methodology they use through sponsorship and whatever to get their money. So you're not only dealing in another country, you're not only dealing with a game that's not known in America, but you're dealing with a different mechanism as far as generating gambling revenue as well.
Yeah, very intricate stuff. Something a little less intricate, and this is a bit of a curiosity question. I've noticed there's an increasing amount of partnerships between Australian or sometimes English NRL/Super League clubs and American clubs. For example, the Roosters with the California Rugby League, the Bears with Boston. Are these just superficial things, or do they actually have tangible benefits to them?
No, I think it's a good thing, and I say that because if the Roosters and the Bears are putting money into US Rugby League, that money will be used to, hopefully do two things. Number one, we need more money in the US Rugby League because we need to get to the point where we can fund an executive office. We need to get to a point where we've got 4 or 5 people in marketing, finance, broadcasting, whatever. We need people working full-time in rugby league in the US, and we don't have it at the moment. So the more money comes in from the Roosters and the Bears, that's a good thing, number one. Number two is that money can be used in certain areas, such as the Roosters in California, and they're going to have a team there next year, or the Bears in Boston. They can use that money to get out in their local communities to drive the awareness of their team and their game, to do two things: get players that might want to try our game, particularly rugby union players, and that's a good market for them to do. And secondly, just make the game aware to people that might come along on a Saturday afternoon and watch a rugby league game. But at the moment, it's very much like park football over there. But the fact that professional clubs like the Roosters and the Bears are going to be putting money in over there. I think it's fantastic. I don't know what sort of return they're going to get in their investment, but from the US's perspective, getting money into the game will allow them to, number one, get an executive office, and number two, give them a bit of an ability to get an awareness program that the game actually exists in America.
Bernie, I'm going to take us from the USA over to the UK. Super League has obviously been struggling for quite a while, and IMG's been brought in to help, etc., etc. There's also been a lot of talk about the NRL actually buying out Super League and running it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I don't know. The buying out depends on what you pay for it, right? If you've got an asset, you've got to make sure you buy an asset that has the value that you're going to pay the cash for. So I don't know financially how that would work. On a philosophical level, the NRL should absolutely be bending over backwards to ensure that we have a healthy English Super League. It's really the only other major competition we have in the world. Like, you know, God love us, we love our game, but it's not a world game. And if you've got a competition, an established competition in the UK, it behooves us to make sure that that stays a very strong, viable competition. So I would love to see, whether it's buying the Super League or even having a formalised partnership with the Super League, which may involve some financial pieces, but it may involve some non-financial pieces where we can send executives over there to potentially assist them to run their clubs, better market their clubs, etc. For example, I would love some money going into the English Rugby League. We have to have a team in London. There's no way you can have a viable English Rugby League. And I know they've tried with the London Broncos, and there's been about 4 or 5 iterations of a team in London over the last 40 years, but they never work. Now, I would like to see a team in London, just to give that would give the profile for our game in the biggest city in the UK. So I think, to your point, Stuart, yes, we have to assist them, whether that's financially or even non-financially. And we have to also develop our schedule around that. For example, the World Club Challenge should always be played in England because it promotes the game. So why would you play a World Club Challenge in Australia when you're preaching to the converted? Why wouldn't you take it to Wigan or London and promote it up big time and, build a big crowd, get a bit of publicity around it? That game should always be played in England, or potentially the World Club Challenge could be played in Las Vegas as part of the suite of games they have there. But either way, back to your point, yeah, the NRL should absolutely be assisting the Super League.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's 13 shareholders with Super League Europe, that being the 12 clubs that are in the Super League and the RFL themselves. I have a feeling, an educated feeling, that the really well-established sort of Leeds and Helens, Wigan, maybe even Catalans, Warrington, they are all on board. They would be all on board with it. It's the ones that are even more hand to mouth, the Salfords, the Huddersfield, even though they've got a rich benefactor, the Castlefords, etc. They're the ones that would be the risk of opposing it. But I have no idea if it's just a simple majority that's needed or whatever it might be. But from a wider game perspective, there's more than just the financial considerations in my mind. It's the fact that you need both hemispheres strong. And
Absolutely.
I go 100% with your answer. We'll come back to Australasia now. Have you got any thoughts on Peter V'landys?
Yeah, look, I think, I don't know Peter. I've met him a couple of times just before I left left Parramatta Eels, and then like I said, the last 4 or so years I've been living back and forth. Look, I think Peter's a very aggressive sports administrator. I don't know him personally. I think he's done some really good things for the league. And that's about all I know about him. I think some of the things they've done, and I don't know whether they're Peter's initiatives or whether they're initiatives of the football department at the NRL. I don't necessarily agree with all them. I think there's some, the 6 agains, the captain's challenges, they're looking to increase the flow of the game, and they introduce a captain's challenge, which stops the game about 6 or 8 times a game, depending on the success of the challenge. The 6 agains, people are saying it's sped up the game. I'm not sure it has. I think in certain cases it does speed the game up, but I'm not so sure it's a good thing. I think if you're offside, you're offside. You should get penalised for it. But So, and I think on the officiating side, there seems to be a lot of grief I read about from clubs, coaches, administrators around how the referees are developed. Um, so there's some of those football areas, and I know in rugby league there's always going to be some drama and debate around football issues, particularly referees and bunkers and that sort of stuff. But look, I think the NRL's done a very good job through Peter and Andrew. Like they've brought a lot of money into the game, and that money is trickling down to the clubs. You now have financially stable clubs, which I think is a core objective of any governing body, to make sure your clubs are financially solvent. So from that point of view, they've done a very good job. They just need to be very careful, I think, on the expansion decisions that they make. Make sure they do the right ones. We went to 20 games there back in the mid-90s, and I know Super League came along and sort of destroyed that, but they've got to make those decisions right. Like the Dolphins has been very successful. I like the idea of a Western Australian team to make the competition national. I think the 19th and 20th teams have to be really thought out very, very thoroughly, whether it's, Papua New Guinea or Western Brisbane or South New Zealand. They got to think that one through very, very carefully around how they go about that. But all in all, if you look at we can all pick problems and issues within the game, but if you looked at it at a macro level, you'd have to say the game at the moment is very healthy under Peter and Andrew.
Speaking about Peter likes to talk about the main competitor a lot, being AFL. Do you think rugby league's gaining ground in AFL, and what would you like to see the NRL do better in Australia?
I think if you compare like TV viewership, I think we beat them last year in aggregated viewership. I think we're beating them again this year in aggregated TV viewership, and that's one of the few metrics you can use to compare. Now, they've always compared ground attendances, and let's face it, they beat us on ground attendances. There's no ifs or buts there, but we're improving dramatically in that area. And the other thing to remember when you're comparing broadcast deals is that our games typically go for it's a 2-hour TV window. Their games are at least a 2.5 hour TV window because their game's longer. So even though they have less games than I think they play 22 games. Even though they play less games, every game gives them about a half an hour to an hour more of TV time. That's why their TV deals have historically been better. There's more advertising capability, and at the end of the day, advertising capability is the key driver of broadcast deals. So they have longer time in each game to broadcast, which means they've got additional time for advertisers. So there's not much rugby league can do about that. Look, I think rugby league they're doing what they can. I don't overly worrying about them I wouldn't be wasting a lot of time, but I do have a couple of thoughts. The AFL, and having been at the Parramatta Eels, I know in Western Sydney, the AFL are making a monumental financial push with the greater Western Sydney Giants. Luckily, it's not really, when you're out there, it's not gaining a huge amount of traction, but they are getting a number of fields and they're negotiating with councils to turn those fields, take down rugby league posts and put up AFL posts. So I think the challenge, if you're looking at a very direct challenge between NRL and AFL, in Western Sydney, including southwestern Sydney, fastest growing area in in Australia demographically, and southeastern Queensland, Brisbane, Gold Coast, and up into Toowoomba, that Western Brisbane corridor, Ipswich up to Toowoomba, I would be spending a lot of money reinforcing my development activities in those two areas because that's what the AFL are doing. Rugby league's on a bit of a roll at the moment. I think there is a real attractiveness to a team in Western Brisbane that would take that corridor from Ipswich all the way out to Toowoomba. I like the idea of having a team there, and it's another rivalry game in Brisbane. But what it does, if we did that, it would cement southeastern Queensland. We'd have all bases covered there, which is where the AFL are attacking us. I think in Western Sydney, we just have to do a very good job at the grassroots level. We have to have I would have a specific strategic plan to ensure that every 6 to 12-year-old kid in the greater Western Sydney becomes a rugby league fan. That would involve, the Eels and the Tigers and the Panthers and the Bulldogs and those clubs that are in that catchment. It'd be a coordinated effort with them so that every kid in that area becomes, a free member of whatever club they fall within the jurisdiction of. They'd be getting merchandise. They'd be getting free tickets to games. I'd be doing everything I could. If you shore up Western Sydney and southeastern Queensland, AFL's got nowhere else to go from a scale point of view. Like, where are they going to go? That is the scale. They're our areas now, but if you're asleep at the wheel, we can lose the grassroots. So I believe a big strategic initiative has to be 6 to 12-year-olds winning the hearts and minds of kids in our existing heartland areas of Western Sydney, southeastern Queensland. If you do that successfully, AFL's dead in the water in Queensland and New South Wales.
Great plan.
Yeah, fantastic answer. Final two questions, Bernie. There are certain NRL clubs that have been in the doldrums for years. Sorry, Stu, I enjoyed reading this question. I know you wrote it, but Bernie, Stu's a West Tigers fan. For the record, I'm a Warriors fan, but I can't got my leg to stand on here. But there's certain NRL clubs that have been in the doldrums for a number of years now. For example, the West Tigers. How do you turn a club around to be successful?
It's very tough. And like when I went to the Roosters at the end of 94, in the prior season being 94, I think we'd finished 13th out of 16 teams in first grade and reserve grade. But, with Nick Politis, Phil Gould, Brian Canavan, myself, we embarked on a journey to try and repair the club. We probably got a little lucky in 96 when Brad Fittler became available because of the Super League war. Couldn't stay at Penrith because he was an ARL player. So through Phil's connection and Nick's influence, we were able to get Brad, which was a huge get for the club. Bottom line these days, like back then, I think it was easier. What we did was a little easier there to rebuild the Roosters. Then if you look now, most of the clubs, they have many more personnel dedicated to recruitment, development pathways. It's very, very competitive out there. You have a lot more agents now. A lot of the players have agents. Every player has an agent, whether from 16 up. So you've got more clubs that are more professionally engineered and structured for recruitment and retention. You have more agents out there manipulating those clubs to get the best deal for their players. That makes the job of rebuilding one club. Oh, the third element there is that the very good clubs, the sharp clubs, any NRL player that they want to keep, you very rarely see a superstar come up for grabs now. And even with the rule now where you can negotiate 1 year out, when you get into 1 November, you can negotiate for the year after. Even then, clubs are tying their players up. You're not getting the superstars becoming available all the time. So a club like the West Tigers, I think is on my view, as I was talking to someone about the Tigers the other night, a friend of mine's a Tigers fan, and I said, look, I think they're on the right track. I think Richardson and the club, whilst they've seemed to have had from the outside a lot of upheavals from a management and organisational structure point of view, when I look at their club, like next year, they're going to have a spine of Coruscant, Luai, Galvin, and Jerome Buller. They will have maybe the best up-and-coming spine in the NRL. Now, doesn't mean they're going to win games, but that gives when you've got that spine, that's going to give them the ability to put the pieces around that spine and improve. They've got a centre of excellence there. I was reading an article the other day about their pathways, their commitment to the pathways program. All those things will help them, but it's a slower burn now. You can't improve as quickly. Like even the Roosters, they grabbed a couple of players. They grabbed Cronk and Tedesco at the end of 2017. That was a very good recruiting. There were needs within their club for those positions. Very good recruiting, and they're off and running again. But they'd have a lot of players that they developed themselves as well. It's very difficult now to do it. So you have to do what Gus is doing at the Bulldogs. He's building development pathways. You have to do what Flanagan's trying to do, albeit last week was a disaster for the Dragons. He's trying to build the club from the inside, build the pathways. And it was interesting a few weeks ago, the Bulldogs beat the Dragons. And I said to a friend of mine, I said, well, there's the difference. The Bulldogs are in year 2 of their rebuild under Serraldo playing the Dragons who were in the year 1 of their rebuild. And the difference was marked. The Bulldogs beat them easily. And I said, that's because they're a year ahead. They're a year ahead of the Dragons in their rebuild. And that's what clubs have to do. They have to build slow. It's a bit more of a slower burn now. And even the Dogs, who are a very, very rich club, very traditional club, very powerful club with Phil there, they haven't gone out and signed. They picked up Kickow 1 year and they picked up Crichton another year. But it's not like they go out and buy 2 or 3 superstars and suddenly they're a big club. They're a powerful club again. It's a slow burn. And I think what the Tigers are doing, the Bulldogs, I think the Dragons are trying to do it. Parramatta, all these clubs internally are building much better pathway systems, but the reality is it's very, very competitive. And the Western Sydney clubs like Parramatta and Penrith, and the Southeastern Queensland clubs like the Broncos, Dolphins, Titans, all 17 clubs are looking in these areas because you got to fish where the fish are. And that's where the fish are. So it's extremely competitive, but the only way to do it is to build the pathways, and then where you can, and the Tigers are doing it with Luai, you cherry pick that one player you go after and you get him and you bring him in. And they did it with Coruscant a couple of years ago as well. So they can cherry pick every year or two and bring in a superstar. But very, very difficult. But Stuart, if you're a Tigers man, I even though it may not look like it, I think they're on the right track. The challenge for them is then, once you've got a good crew of young 16 to 19-year-olds, getting an adequate conversion of them into legitimate NRL players over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. Yep. That's the challenge.
Oh, I like that answer, Bernie. There's some hope. Talking about NRL clubs, they're finally acquiring tangible assets to grow their worth. How important is it that all NRL clubs diversify away from their leagues clubs?
Well, look, I grew up in the rugby league ecosystem whereby leagues clubs supported football clubs. So you had this, when I used to explain it to people overseas, well, I said, you got these grandmas and grandpas putting money in poker machines and that pays the footballs. And they said, I don't understand that. I said, don't worry, neither do I. But that's what was happening, right? That's what's happened from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's what happened. People were playing poker machines, and for your big clubs like, South when they were doing well, or St George when they were doing well, and Bulldogs and Roosters, they had very powerful leagues clubs pouring. The football club would lose 1, 2, 3 million, and the leagues club would just write them a check. That's changed, thank God, because society evolves. Rugby league has to evolve. The rugby league economic system has to evolve with it. So what you're seeing now is the game is getting what it's worth through broadcasting. So, and I think now the broadcasting revenue per club is approximately 16 to 17 million. The salary cap's about 13. So you've got when I was in the game, we always hoped we could get a salary cap that at least covers the payment to the players, matching the salary cap. Well, they're well in advance of that now, which is a great thing. Because clubs now can take a deep breath. They can do some legitimate strategy because they know it's not a hand-to-mouth existence anymore for clubs. They work hard for their revenues, but most of them are going to make a profit. So moving away from leagues club dependence is a very good thing. And look, it's not only a good thing for the rugby league club, but let's face it, it's a good thing for society. Like, we shouldn't be in the business of promoting gambling. Now, is gambling always going to be there? Of course it is. We're not going to stop it. But it doesn't mean the game and the leagues clubs and TV advertising have to promote it. Like, I know there's the argument now about TV advertising of gambling, and there's a lot of gambling advertising on TV. I think it's wrong. I think they need to drop that back dramatically. And you know what? I have friends who are in the gambling industry and they believe it's wrong too. Analogous to that is leagues clubs and poker machines. Sure, you always want to have them as a source of enjoyment and something for people to go to the club, drop 20 in the pokies and have a good time and go home. But of course, we know that it does, addiction to poker machines causes a big problem. And I don't think our game over time wants to be associated with that, to be quite honest with you. We want to be associated with the club industry because the club industry has done some wonderful, wonderful things for the game of rugby league with grants to junior league. They pay a lot of the fees that go with junior league. So we love the club industry, but the club industry is now getting to a point too where the club industry is diversifying away from having such a dependency on gambling. They're buying other clubs. They're having golf. They've got golf clubs. They've got social clubs. They've got restaurants. They're making sure they're getting a much better balanced portfolio of segments of their business, not just gambling. So I think in the broader sense, it's a good thing for the club industry. And of course, the club industry is an industry that rugby league quite rightly is related to. So I think over time, it's going to be a very, very good thing for rugby league, good for the clubs and good for society, that we go away from the reliance on gambling to fund our game.
One final question, which is related to your answer just then. I've noticed Well, but the gist of the question is, are you a suburban stadium man or are you a big stadium man? But the context behind it is clubs that are playing out of Cogra, Campbelltown, even Leichhardt, Shark Park with this limited capacity, surely they'll fall further and further behind to a certain degree compared to clubs like the Broncos, the Roosters, even the Cowboys, who are playing out of large capacity, magnificent brand spanking new stadium.
Well, Parramatta,
Uh,
Parramatta Combank's magnificent.
Parramatta, great example. Penrith in a few years' time. Um, can you talk? Can you talk to the suburban stadium versus larger stadium, and are some clubs at risk of being left behind?
Yeah, yeah. Luckily, they're not as at risk as they would have been had the game not be successful with their broadcasting revenues. Let's say a big club like the Broncos, Roosters, or the Eels. Let's say they're generating $1 million more, and I'm making the numbers up, but let's say they generate $1 million more in hospitality revenue because they've got the hospitality facilities at a beautiful brand new stadium. That they'll be $1 million behind. But luckily, with the fact that most clubs are profitable now and the salary cap is in there, it's not like they can pay $1 million more to their players. They can't. The salary cap's there. So from an on-field competitive, it shouldn't have a difference. But what it does do is that if some of these bigger clubs are socking away that $1 million more every year, makes their club more financially sustainable. It also cuts to the enjoyment factor. For example, I'm older and I'm a traditionalist. So did I love going to Leichhardt Oval? I still do. Do I think it's the future of the game? No, I don't. I don't. I think the future of game is Combank Stadium, Queensland, North Queensland Stadium. I think Combank at 30,000 is the prototype week to week stadium where even with 20,000, you got a great atmosphere. The facilities are beautiful. The access and egress is very good. North Queensland has the same thing. The Roosters have a beautiful 45,000 seat stadium. Melbourne has a good stadium. Most of your regional people have good stadiums. We really need to do something about the Dragons in Wollongong, the Sea Eagles in Brookvale, the Tigers. The Tigers need to probably determine where there is a home. They're a bit of a gypsy, the Tigers, which I think impacts their identity to a degree. But yeah, I think clubs in Sydney that can get to that 25,000 at least stadium, but it doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles. But if you could do that, so I don't think, for example, the best promotion of our game is to be playing semi-final games at grounds where you can attract 15,000 people. That's not a good look for our game. Does it mean that you can't play a game a year, for example, at a Leichhardt and maybe a trial game? But I mean, if you're relying on them week to week, to your point, you are falling behind financially. Much as we love the romanticism of going to Leichhardt or going to North Sydney Oval, those sort of things, it's all nice traditional stuff. But I think the future of the game is to get a more modern stadium, but they have to be right sized. I'd love to see a 25,000 seater facility at Brookvale. I'd love to see one at Wollongong. Love to see one somewhere in Western Sydney for the Tigers, or southwestern Sydney. But that's a real challenge economically because when you get into building stadiums, you need government support. Then you have the philosophical argument of why rugby league should be getting more money after you've just built Allianz, you've just built Combank. They play it, the Bulldogs play out of Accor Stadium, which is a government-owned funded stadium. You then get to the problem of whether we should be putting more government money into stadiums. That's a philosophical argument. But from a supporter and corporate hospitality perspective, the grounds like Combank and North Queensland Stadium, that 30,000 seats about right, but you'd probably have to do that for around 25,000 maybe for some of the other Sydney clubs. But it's a real challenge on an ongoing basis.
We never know. Maybe we'll reach a day well down the track where a club has, $500 million to build their own stadium.
Well, yeah. Well, it's funny though. You say that in America, where their club, we talk in millions, they talk in billions. They tend to, and maybe not the right word, but they tend to blackmail governments into building the stadiums for them because they say, well, if you don't, the owner says, well, if you don't build this stadium here, I'm moving the team to another city, and they have an ability to do that because they're privately owned. We don't
seem to do that with grand finals.
What's that?
We seem to do that with grand finals.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, the stadium issue for Sydney clubs is they've partially solved some of them, but longer term, there's some issues down the tracks for your Cronullers, your Dragons, your Sea Eagles, Tigers, as to how you've got to at some point bring them up into the 21st century and give fans the comfort and give corporates the comfort as well to make sure that they're engaged with your game.
Yeah. All right. Well, absolute pleasure. This is the most mentally stimulated I've been in weeks since I got made redundant from my job. In fact, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Bernie. Have you got anything to add before we wrap it up?
No, just absolute pleasure to come on, and happy to, I'm a rugby league fan since I was a young boy. I'm still a crazy rugby league fan, even though I've got a bit of a history in the game. I'm still at heart a fan. So, no, I love the game and I love to see it doing well. So, hopefully you guys that run the podcast and keep people engaged with the game are successful. I think it's great.
I've really enjoyed it, Bernie, and as a fan, I'd love to see you back in the game doing something too, because you've got some great thoughts and ideas.
Thanks for listening to Everything Rugby League. If you like this episode, give the show a follow and leave a review. For more news and insights, follow us on Facebook or head to everythingrugbyleague.com.